A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Imagine you are the leader of a brand new nation. You've just come through a war for survival. You're managing a massive influx of refugees that doubles your population in 3 years, and your economy is basically running on fumes and sheer willpower. Most leaders in that position would be looking for the grandest palace available to project power and stability to the world. But instead, you decide that the best place for the seat of moral authority is a small wooden shack in the middle of a literal desert, where you spend your afternoons reading philosophy in the original Greek and your mornings working in the communal kitchen or the sheep stalls. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the life and leadership of David Ben-Gurion, specifically looking at his radical commitment to non-dependence, his personal austerity, and this concept of Mamlachtiyut, or statism, that defined the early years of Israel. It is a wild contrast to how we think about leadership today in 2026, where everything is about global integration, polished public relations, and personal branding.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I have been looking forward to this one because Ben-Gurion is such a fascinating case study in what I call the founder's paradox. You have a man who was essentially a revolutionary, a guy who spent decades operating in the shadows of the British Mandate, leading underground organizations and labor unions. Then, the moment he becomes the head of a sovereign state, he pivots entirely to this philosophy of Mamlachtiyut. We usually translate that as statism, but it is deeper than that. It comes from the Hebrew word for kingdom or sovereignty. It was this intense, almost religious belief that the state must replace all the old partisan and sectarian loyalties. He wanted to take a population that was incredibly diverse, coming from dozens of different cultures and languages, and forge them into a single, unified national identity through the sheer force of state institutions. He was trying to build a clock while the gears were still being forged in a furnace.
It sounds almost authoritarian when you put it that way, but there was a very practical, survivalist edge to it, right? He was not just doing it for the sake of power. He seemed to believe that if they did not achieve a total sense of national unity and economic self-reliance immediately, the whole project would just collapse under its own weight. It was a race against time.
To understand Ben-Gurion, you have to understand his fear of fragility. He saw the Jewish people as historically vulnerable because they were dependent on others. His entire life's work was about ending that dependency. This brings us to the core tension of his leadership, was his asceticism, the simple clothes, the desert hut, the rejection of luxury, a genuine personal philosophy or a calculated political performance to enforce national sacrifice. I would argue it was both. He knew that you cannot ask a nation to live on rations if the leader is eating caviar. He was setting the tone for a collective ethos that he felt was the only way to survive the 1950s.
Let's define that term Mamlachtiyut a bit more for the listeners. It is not just the government does things. It was a specific shift from the era of movements to the era of the state. Before 1948, everything in the Jewish community in Palestine was run by political parties. Your healthcare, your school, your sports club, even your militia depended on which party you belonged to. Ben-Gurion wanted to smash that. He wanted the state to be the only provider of those services.
And that was a massive political battle. He was essentially telling his own supporters that the party they had built for 40 years was now secondary to the state. This leads us directly into the mechanics of non-dependence. Ben-Gurion was obsessed with the idea of autarky, the quality of being self-sufficient. In his mind, sovereignty was not just a legal status or a flag, it was a physical and economic reality. If you cannot feed your own people, if you cannot defend your own borders with your own weapons, and if you cannot produce your own energy, then you are not truly free. You are just a client state waiting to be sold out.
This led to some incredibly radical policies in the 1950s. specifically the period known as the Tzena, or the austerity period. I want to dig into that because it feels so foreign to our modern consumer mindset. We are talking about a decade where the government literally rationed everything: food, clothing, furniture. You had a little blue book that told you how many eggs you were allowed to buy per month. Erman, give us the technical breakdown of how the Tzena actually worked.
The Tzena, which lasted from 1949 to roughly 1959, was led by a man named Dov Yosef, the Minister of Rationing and Supply. It was a total command economy. The state was broke. They were absorbing hundreds of thousands of immigrants, many of whom arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The foreign currency reserves were non-existent. So the government decided to control the price and distribution of every essential good. You had the Lakal line of products, utility furniture, utility clothes that were standardized and cheap. But Ben-Gurion saw a moral dimension in this. He believed that the pioneer spirit, the Halutz mindset, required a rejection of bourgeois comforts. He wanted the people to embrace a Spartan lifestyle because he believed that luxury led to weakness. He famously refused a more comfortable chair for his office because it was too plush. He wanted to live the same life as the people in the transit camps, or at least he wanted to project that he was.
That is where the Staboker experiment comes in. For those who do not know, Staboker is a kibbutz in the Negev desert. In 1953, at the height of his power, Ben-Gurion resigned as prime minister and moved into a simple hut there. He said he wanted to be a simple laborer. Now, I have always been a bit cheeky about this. Was he actually out there milking cows? Or was this the ultimate political theater? A way to shame the urban elites in Tel Aviv into moving to the periphery?
The records show he actually did work. He worked in the peach orchards and the sheep stalls, though obviously he was also receiving world leaders and writing his memoirs. But you are right that it was a massive symbolic gesture. He had this vision that the desert was the future. He famously said that if the state does not put an end to the desert will put an end to the state. By moving there, he was trying to prove that the Zionist mission was not over just because they had won the war in 1948. He was trying to pivot the national energy from military defense to internal development. He saw the Negev as the ultimate test of human will against nature. If they could make the desert bloom, they could do anything.
It is interesting because that focus on the desert and communal living really ties back to the technical role of the kibbutz. We talked about this a bit in episode 991, but it is worth revisiting here. Ben-Gurion did not just see the kibbutzim as social experiments. He saw them as a mechanism for border defense and agricultural scaling. It was a very pragmatic use of a collectivist ethos to solve a national security problem.
The kibbutz was the perfect instrument for Mamlachtiyut in the early days. It provided a pre-packaged social structure that could be dropped into a strategic location. You have a group of highly motivated, ideologically driven people who can farm the land during the day and man the perimeter at night. Ben-Gurion used them as the front line of the state. But here is the fascinating tension. As much as he loved the kibbutz movement, he was also the one who systematically stripped them of their independent power. Before the state was founded, the kibbutzim had their own elite fighting forces, like the Palmach. One of Ben-Gurion's most controversial moves was the dissolution of the Palmach and the merging of all these various militias into a single, state-controlled military, the Israel Defense Forces, or Tzahal.
That must have been a massive political gamble. You were taking the most ideologically committed, most effective soldiers you have, people who are often aligned with your political rivals on the left, and you were telling them they have to take orders from a centralized bureaucracy. How did he pull that off without a civil war?
It came very close to a civil war. The Altalena affair in June 1948 is the most famous example, where the government actually fired on a ship carrying arms for a rival militia, the Irgun. Ben-Gurion's logic was uncompromising. There can only be one gun in the state, and that gun must be in the hands of the government. He viewed the existence of partisan militias as a direct threat to sovereignty. He was willing to sacrifice the prestige and the unique culture of those elite units to ensure that the state had a monopoly on force. This is the essence of Mamlachtiyut. It is the transition from a movement to a nation. You move from the romantic, chaotic era of the underground to the boring, hierarchical era of the civil service.
This transition seems to be where a lot of the modern friction in Israeli society started. If you look at the early Department of Foreign Affairs or the early civil service, it was very much built in Ben-Gurion's image. Very formal, very focused on the state as the ultimate arbiter of value. But that also meant a lot of the old organic community structures were pushed aside. He wanted a melting pot, a kua hitush, where everyone would become this new Hebrew person. But in doing that, did he create a system that was too rigid?
That is exactly the critique that has gained a lot of ground in recent decades. The melting pot was efficient for building an army and a basic economy, but it was often incredibly insensitive to the cultural heritage of immigrants from North Africa and the Middle East, the Mizrahi Jews. Ben-Gurion's version of the new Jew was very much modeled on the European socialist ideal. He saw the state as a pedagogical tool to re-educate the people. While that centralization allowed Israel to survive its first decade, it also created these long-term structural rigidities. You see this most clearly in the economy, particularly with the Histadrut, which was the General Federation of Labor.
The Histadrut is such a weird entity to explain to people outside of Israel. It was not just a labor union. It was an employer, a healthcare provider, a construction company, and a bank, all rolled into one. At one point, it was the second largest employer in the country after the government. How did Ben-Gurion view that? Was it an arm of the state or a rival to it?
He saw it as a temporary necessity that eventually became a bit of a monster. In the beginning, the Histadrut was the only organization with the infrastructure to actually build the country. They built the roads, the hospitals, and the factories. Ben-Gurion used them to implement his non-dependent strategy. If the private sector was too small or too timid to build a steel mill or a shipping line, the Histadrut would do it with government backing. This created a massive, state-aligned industrial complex. The goal was autarky. They wanted to produce everything domestically so they would not be vulnerable to boycotts or supply chain disruptions.
Which sounds great for national security, but sounds like a nightmare for economic efficiency. If you were protecting these massive state-linked monopolies from foreign competition, you were basically locking in high prices and low innovation. We actually touched on this in episode 1334, when we talked about the protectionism trap. It feels like Ben-Gurion's obsession with non-dependence in the 1950s laid the groundwork for the cost of living crisis people are still dealing with today.
The legacy is very complicated. On one hand, that state-led development created the foundation for everything that came later. You do not get the startup nation without the massive investments in education, infrastructure, and defense research that happened under Ben-Gurion. He was the one who pushed for the creation of the nuclear reactor in Dimona and the development of the aerospace industry. These were high-risk, high-capital projects that no private investor would have touched in 1955. He viewed technology as a strategic asset. He famously met with Albert Einstein and tried to get him to be the president of Israel. He was obsessed with the idea that the Jewish people's greatest resource was their intellectual capacity.
So he was a techno-optimist before that was even a term. But he was a techno-optimist who lived in a hut and ate cottage cheese. It is such a strange combination. Usually, when we think of people pushing for high-tech development, we think of the Silicon Valley aesthetic, which is all about disruption and individual wealth. Ben-Gurion's version was all about national survival and collective sacrifice.
It was a very different kind of motivation. He did not want people to get rich, he wanted the state to be unassailable. There is a deep irony in how this evolved. The very institutions he built to ensure non-dependence eventually became the bottlenecks that the next generation had to break through. By the 1970s and 80s, the Histadrut-controlled economy was stagnating. It was too centralized, too bureaucratic, and too protected. It took a series of major economic reforms to open things up and allow the private sector to take over as the engine of growth. But you could argue that the private sector only succeeded because it was standing on the shoulders of the state-built infrastructure.
Let's look at the comparison to other states. You mentioned Singapore and Japan earlier. How does the Ben-Gurion model stack up against Lee Kuan Yew or the post-war Japanese recovery?
The parallels with Lee Kuan Yew and Singapore are actually quite striking. Both men were obsessed with the fragility of their tiny nations. Both were incredibly well-read and intellectually rigorous. Both lived relatively modest lives while building massive state machinery. And both believed that the state had a moral obligation to shape the character of the citizens. The difference is that Israel's democratic tradition was always much more fractious and chaotic than Singapore's. Ben-Gurion had to fight for every inch of his authority in a way that Lee Kuan Yew did not. He was constantly dealing with coalition politics, internal party coups, and a very vocal press. In Japan, you had the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MIT, which directed the economy in a very similar way to how Ben-Gurion used the Histadrut and the Ministry of Finance. It was developmental statism, the idea that the market is too important to be left to the businessmen.
I want to go back to the personal side of this, though. Ben-Gurion's modesty. We live in an era where politicians are constantly being scrutinized for their private jets and their luxury watches. Ben-Gurion's house in Tel Aviv is basically a library with a bed in it. He had something like 20,000 books. When he died, he left almost nothing in terms of personal wealth. Do you think that kind of leadership is even possible in a modern, globalized world? Could a leader today live in a desert shack and still maintain their authority?
It would be seen as a gimmick today. In Ben-Gurion's time, it worked because the stakes were so high and the poverty was so widespread. When the whole country is living on rations, the leader living in a hut feels like solidarity. Today, when we have a thriving middle class and a globalized economy, that kind of asceticism would feel performative. But there is a deeper lesson there about the source of authority. Ben-Gurion's authority did not come from his title or his lifestyle. It came from his clarity of purpose. He knew exactly what he wanted to achieve, and he was willing to make any trade-off to get there. He was willing to be unpopular. He was willing to break his own party. He was willing to alienate his closest friends if he thought it served the interest of the state.
That clarity of purpose is something that feels very missing in modern politics. Everything now is about consensus building and incremental change. Ben-Gurion was a man of the grand gesture and the absolute decision. But that also meant he had some massive blind spots. His focus on Mamlachtiyut meant he often ignored the internal social tensions that would eventually boil over. He thought the state would solve everything, but the state is just a collection of people, and people have memories and grievances that a bureaucracy cannot just plan away.
He definitely underestimated the persistence of tribalism. He thought that by putting everyone in the same uniform and making them speak the same language, the old divisions would just evaporate. But as we see in modern Israel, those divisions, religious versus secular, Ashkenazi versus Sephardi, right versus left, are still very much there. In some ways, his attempt to suppress those identities through the state actually made them more resilient. People felt they had to fight to preserve their heritage against a state that wanted to homogenize them.
It is a classic case of the second-order effects we always talk about. You solve the problem of national survival by centralizing power, but in doing so, you create a new problem of social alienation. It makes me think about the founder's paradox again. The traits that make someone a great founder. The uncompromising will, the centralization of power, the radical vision, are often the very things that become liabilities as the organization or the state matures.
That is the takeaway for any leader. Ben-Gurion statism was essential for the 1950s, but by the 1960s it was already starting to feel stifling. The country needed more space for individual initiative, for dissent, and for a diverse market. The tragedy of many great leaders is that they do not know when to step back and let the system they built evolve past them. Ben-Gurion did try to step back, though. He went to Stoboker, he resigned multiple times, but he always seemed to get pulled back in because he could not stand to see his vision being corrupted by the messy reality of politics.
I want to look at the non-dependence aspect again through a modern lens. In 1948, non-dependence meant growing your own wheat and making your own bullets. In 2026, what does non-dependence even look like? We are so interconnected now. Can a nation truly go it alone in any meaningful way?
This is something we explored in episode 474, and the answer is that total non-dependence is an illusion in the modern world. No country is an island. But you can have strategic non-dependence. You can ensure that you have the internal capability to pivot if global supply chains fail. You see this today with the push for domestic semiconductor manufacturing in the United States and Europe. That is a very Ben-Gurionist idea. It is the realization that if you do not control the foundational technology of your era, your sovereignty is at the mercy of whoever does. Ben-Gurion would have been all over the AI and automation space. He would have seen it as the new frontier of national power.
He probably would have been writing prompts himself. But seriously, his focus on the desert as a technical challenge is a great example of this. He did not just want to live there. He wanted to solve the problem of water and energy in arid environments. He was looking for a technical solution to a geographic limitation. That mindset, that geography is not destiny if you have enough engineering talent, is the direct ancestor of the Israeli desalination industry and the high-tech agricultural sector. It is the idea that the state's role is to fund the impossible research that eventually becomes a commercial industry.
And that brings us to the practical takeaways for our listeners. If you are not building a nation-state in the desert, what do you do with this information? I think the concept of Mamlachtiyut can be applied to any organization. It is the idea of putting the mission of the collective above the interests of the individual departments or factions. In a company, that means breaking down the silos and ensuring everyone is working for the state, which is the company's core purpose, rather than their own career advancement.
And the idea of non-dependence is a great framework for personal strategy. Ask yourself, what are the things I am currently dependent on that I have no control over? If those things were taken away tomorrow, what would I do? Building a little bit of strategic depth in your own life, whether that is learning a new skill, diversifying your income, or just simplifying your lifestyle so you need less. That is a very Ben-Gurion way to live. It gives you a level of freedom that no amount of money can buy.
It is the freedom to say no. Ben-Gurion could say no to the big powers of his day because he was willing to let his people live on rations if that is what it took to stay free. If you are not willing to sacrifice your comfort, you are always going to be dependent on the people who provide that comfort. It is a hard truth, but it is one that Ben-Gurion lived every day of his life.
I also think there is a lesson in how he handled the periphery. He didn't just govern from the center. He went to the place that everyone else was ignoring, and he said, "This is where the future is. In any field there is always a negev, a neglected area that everyone thinks is useless or too difficult. The real leaders are the ones who go there and prove them wrong. They are the ones who find the value where everyone else sees a wasteland."
And he did it without a PR firm. He just did it. There is something so refreshing about that. No focus groups, no polling, just a guy with a vision and a very old pair of work boots. It is a reminder that at the end of the day, leadership is about character. It is about who you are when no one is looking and who you are when everyone is looking and they are all screaming at you.
There is a very poignant letter he wrote late in his life where he talks about feeling like a stranger in the country he helped create. He saw the rising consumerism of the 1960s, the people buying cars and televisions, and he felt it was a betrayal of the pioneer spirit. He could not reconcile the success of the state with the decline of the Spartan ethos he loved. He did not realize that the whole point of building a strong, secure state is so that the next generation doesn't have to live in a hut and eat rations. He succeeded so well that he made his own lifestyle obsolete.
That is the ultimate irony of the founder. If you do your job perfectly, you become unnecessary. The patriotism tax. We discussed in episode 1334, the high cost people pay for independence eventually becomes a burden they want to shed once they feel safe. Ben-Gurion's desert shack remains as a symbol of the limits of human will against global market forces. You can hold back the tide of consumerism and individualism for a while through sheer force of personality, but eventually the world catches up.
It is a good place to wrap this up. Ben-Gurion is one of those figures who only gets more complex the more you study him. He was a man of contradictions. A socialist who built a state capitalist engine, a pacifist who was a master of war, a city dweller who became the symbol of the desert. But through all of it, that thread of Mamlachtiyut and non-dependence stayed constant. It is a model that built a country, and even if it is not the model for today, it is one we ignore at our own peril.
Well said. It is about the transition from being a victim of history to being an architect of it, and that is a lesson that applies far beyond the borders of any one country.
We could go on for another hour about the specific technical details of the water carrier system or the development of the aerospace industry, but I think we have hit the core of the philosophy. Thanks to Daniel for the prompt. It is always good to revisit the foundations, especially when they are as interesting as a prime minister in a desert shack.
This was a deep one. I am going to go find a simple wooden chair to sit in and think about my own dependency ratios.
Don't get too comfortable, Herman. We have more episodes to record. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and allow us to dive deep into these complex histories.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are finding value in these deep dives, please consider leaving us a review on your podcast app. It really does help other people find the show and join the conversation.
You can find us at myweirdprompts.com for our full archive and all the ways to subscribe. We will see you in the next one.
Stay curious.
And maybe spend a little time in the desert. Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weirding.